Maya Rodriguez clutched the worn envelope containing her father's medical bills as she sat in the sterile waiting room of Memorial Hospital. The numbers on those papers felt like a death sentence, not for her father but for any hope she had of saving him. $300,000 for the experimental treatment that could extend his life by years, maybe even cure his rare blood disorder completely. At 25, Maya had already sacrificed everything for her family. She dropped out of nursing school when her mother died in a car accident 2 years ago, leaving behind massive debts and her father's mounting medical expenses. She worked 3 jobs, cleaning offices at night, waitressing during lunch shifts, and tutoring kids in the evenings. But it was never enough. The money disappeared as quickly as it came in, swallowed by rent, basic living expenses, and her father's regular treatments. Her father, Carlos, had been her hero growing up. He immigrated from Mexico with nothing but determination and dreams, working construction during the day and learning English at night. He built a small but successful landscaping business, put Maya through high school, and was saving for her college education when the illness struck. Now he lay in that hospital bed growing weaker each day, pretending to be strong for her sake while she pretended not to notice how his hands shook when he thought she wasn't looking. The insurance company had denied the experimental treatment twice, calling it investigational and not medically necessary. Maya had appealed, begged, and even tried to set up a crowdfunding campaign that barely raised $2,000. She was running out of options and, more importantly, running out of time. The doctors said her father had maybe 6 months without the treatment, possibly 5 years with it. That's when her friend Carmen mentioned something she'd overheard at the upscale restaurant where she worked as a server. Wealthy people sometimes made unusual arrangements, she said. Business deals that went beyond money. Carmen had been vague about the details, but she gave Maya a phone number and an address in the city's most exclusive district. Maya stared at the piece of paper for 3 days before making the call. The voice that answered was crisp, professional, and surprisingly warm. Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell explained that she represented certain clients who valued discretion and were willing to help people in desperate situations. The arrangements were always consensual, always temporary, and always beneficial to both parties. She invited Maya to tea the following afternoon. Mrs. Hartwell's townhouse was unlike anything Maya had ever seen. Crystal chandeliers, Persian rugs, and artwork that probably cost more than Maya's family had ever made in a year. Mrs. Hartwell herself was elegant in her 60s, with silver hair perfectly styled and kind eyes that seemed to see right through Maya's brave facade. Over delicate china cups filled with Earl Grey tea, Mrs. Hartwell explained the situation with startling directness. Dr. Alexander Kane was one of the city's most renowned cardiac surgeons, brilliant in the operating room but impossible in his personal life. At 38, he had built a medical empire but couldn't maintain a relationship longer than a few months. His reputation for arrogance and emotional coldness was legendary among the city's social elite. The arrangement was simple on paper but complex in reality. Maya would enter into a marriage contract with Dr. Kane for exactly 2 years. She would live in his mansion, accompany him to social functions, and present the image of a devoted wife. In return, her father's treatment would be paid for in full, plus a substantial sum for Maya herself. The contract included strict confidentiality clauses and detailed expectations for her behavior and appearance. Maya's first instinct was to leave immediately. The whole thing sounded like something from a desperate movie plot. But then she thought about her father's face that morning, how he'd tried to hide his pain when he thought she wasn't watching. She thought about the medical bills piling up and the collection calls that came every day. She thought about the clock ticking away his remaining time. Mrs. Hartwell must have sensed her internal struggle because she gently placed a folder on the coffee table between them. Inside were photos of Dr. Kane's previous arrangements. Beautiful women who had lived in his mansion for predetermined periods before moving on to successful lives funded by their time with him. There were also testimonials, carefully written accounts of women who described the experience as challenging but ultimately transformative. The final document in the folder was a bank statement showing the payment that would be made for her father's treatment, the full amount needed, transferred within 24 hours of signing the contract. Maya's hands trembled as she read the number. It was more than enough. It was salvation. That evening, Maya sat beside her father's hospital bed and watched him sleep. The machines monitoring his vital signs beeped steadily, a mechanical rhythm that had become the soundtrack to her nightmares. She imagined a different sound, the silence of those machines turned off forever. Then she imagined another scenario. Her father recovered, strong again, maybe even able to return to work. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. Maya had been protecting and providing for her family her entire adult life. This was just another sacrifice, albeit a larger and stranger one than she'd ever made before. She pulled out her phone and dialed Mrs. Hartwell's number. The appointment to meet Dr. Kane was scheduled for the next day. The Kane Medical Center towered over the city's financial district like a glass and steel monument to success. Maya stood on the sidewalk outside, adjusting her only good dress for the third time and trying to calm her racing heart. She had researched Dr. Alexander Kane extensively the night before, finding articles about his groundbreaking surgical techniques, his charitable foundations, and his reputation as one of the most eligible bachelors in the city. What she hadn't found was any warmth in his professional photographs or interviews. The elevator to the top floor seemed to move in slow motion. Maya caught glimpses of her reflection in the polished steel doors, pale, nervous, completely out of place in this world of wealth and power. Mrs. Hartwell had coached her on what to expect, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of Dr. Kane's private office. The space was vast and minimalist, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. Medical awards and diplomas covered one wall, while the others displayed abstract art that probably cost more than most people's houses. Behind an imposing mahogany desk sat Dr. Alexander Kane himself, and Maya's first thought was that the photographs hadn't done him justice. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that was perfectly styled and intense, green eyes that seemed to analyze everything they looked at. He wore a perfectly tailored suit that probably cost more than Maya made in 6 months, and when he stood to greet her, his movements had the confident precision of a man accustomed to controlling every situation he entered. Their handshake was brief and professional, his hand warm and strong against hers. When he spoke, his voice was deep and measured with the kind of authority that made people listen, but there was something cold in his manner, a distance that made Maya feel like a specimen being examined, rather than a person being met. Dr. Kane gestured for her to sit in one of the leather chairs facing his desk, then returned to his own seat without any of the small talk Maya had expected. He opened a thick folder and began reviewing what she assumed were the details Mrs. Hartwell had provided about her situation. The silence stretched uncomfortably as he read, his expression revealing nothing about his thoughts. When he finally looked up, his gaze was direct and unsettling. He asked her questions about her background, her education, her family situation, and her understanding of what the arrangement would entail. His tone was clinical, as if he were taking a medical history rather than interviewing a potential wife. Maya answered honestly, trying to project confidence she didn't feel while fighting the urge to fidget under his intense scrutiny. Dr. Kane explained his expectations with the same precision he probably used to describe surgical procedures. She would live in his home, accompany him to professional and social events, and maintain the appearance of a happy marriage in all public settings. Their private lives would remain separate. She would have her own wing of the house, her own schedule, and her own interests. The arrangement was purely business, he emphasized, designed to solve problems for both of them. He needed a wife to satisfy the expectations of the hospital board and his wealthy patients, who seemed to trust married doctors more than bachelors. The social obligations of his position required a companion, and his previous attempts at dating had been disasters that ended in tabloid headlines and damaged professional relationships. Maya needed money for her father's treatment, and a chance to start over once the 2 years were complete. The contract he presented was thick and detailed, covering everything from her wardrobe allowance to her social media presence. Maya tried to read through the legal language, but the words seemed to blur together. The only numbers that mattered were clear enough. Her father's treatment would be paid for within 24 hours of signing, and she would receive a substantial sum at the end of the 2-year period. Dr. Kane watched her struggle with the document and, for the first time, showed something that might have been sympathy. He explained the key points in simpler terms, answering her questions with patience that surprised her. When she asked about personal freedom and privacy, he assured her that she would have both. When she worried about her father's ongoing care, He promised that would be handled by the best medical team in the city. There was one moment during their meeting when Maya thought she saw something human in Dr. Kane's carefully controlled expression. She had been describing her father's illness and the progression of his symptoms, when she noticed Dr. Kane's hands tighten slightly on his desk. When she looked up, there was something in his eyes that looked almost like understanding, maybe even pain. But the moment passed quickly, and his professional mask slipped back into place. As their meeting concluded, Dr. Kane stood and moved to the windows overlooking the city. He spoke without turning around, his voice softer than it had been all afternoon. He told her that he understood desperate situations and impossible choices. He said that while their arrangement might seem cold and transactional, he would treat her with respect and ensure her comfort. The decision was entirely hers, he added, and she could take as much time as she needed to think it over. Maya looked out at the city spread below them and thought about her father lying in his hospital bed, waiting for news about his treatment options. She thought about the collection notices piling up at home and the jobs that barely covered their basic expenses. She thought about the 2 years stretching ahead of her and what her life might look like when they were over. When she told Dr. Kane that she was ready to sign the contract, he turned back to face her with an expression she couldn't read. He called his assistant to witness the signatures and arrange for the immediate transfer of funds to cover her father's treatment. As Maya signed her name on the final page, she felt like she was stepping off the edge of a cliff, not knowing if she would fly or fall. The last thing Dr. Kane said to her was that a car would pick her up the next morning to bring her to his house. He handed her a business card with his personal phone number and told her to call if she had any questions or concerns. When their eyes met for that final moment, Maya thought she saw something almost like regret in his expression, but she couldn't be sure if it was regret about the arrangement or regret about the circumstances that had made it necessary. The Kane mansion sat behind wrought iron gates in the city's most exclusive neighborhood, surrounded by perfectly manicured gardens that looked like something from a home and garden magazine. As the black town car pulled into the circular driveway, Maya pressed her face to the window and tried to process that this would be her home for the next 2 years. The house was massive, built from honey-colored stone with tall windows and elegant architectural details that spoke of old money and established power. Mrs. Henderson, the housekeeper, greeted Maya at the front door with a warm smile that immediately put her at ease. She was a woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a neat bun and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. As she led Maya through the grand foyer with its marble floors and crystal chandelier, she chattered about the house's history and Dr. Kane's daily routines with the comfortable familiarity of someone who had worked there for many years. Maya's suite of rooms was larger than the entire apartment she had shared with her father. The bedroom had a king-sized bed with luxurious linens, a sitting area with a fireplace, and French doors that opened onto a private balcony overlooking the gardens. The bathroom was like something from a luxury hotel, with a deep soaking tub and a shower that could fit 4 people. The walk-in closet was already filled with clothes in her exact size, everything from casual wear to formal gowns that probably cost more than her father's monthly medication. Mrs. Henderson explained that Dr. Kane was rarely home during the day due to his surgical schedule and hospital responsibilities. He typically left before 6 in the morning and returned sometime between 8 and 10 in the evening, depending on his caseload. Their paths would cross mainly during scheduled social events and the occasional dinner at home when he didn't have evening commitments at the hospital. The first few days passed in a blur of adjustment and overwhelming luxury. Maya spent her mornings walking through the house trying to memorize the layout and understand the routines of the small staff that kept everything running smoothly. The cook, Maria, was a cheerful woman who spoke with a slight accent and seemed determined to put weight on Maya's too thin frame. The gardener, James, was a quiet man who had worked for the Kane family for over 20 years and knew every plant on the extensive grounds. Maya's phone calls with her father were the highlight of each day. The experimental treatment had begun immediately after Dr. Kane's payment cleared, and the change in her father's voice was already noticeable. He sounded stronger, more hopeful, asking about her new job with curiosity rather than the worried tone he'd used for months. Maya had told him she was working as a live-in assistant for a wealthy doctor, which wasn't entirely untrue. Her first social event as Mrs. Kane was a charity gala for the Children's Hospital held at the city's most exclusive hotel. Maya spent hours getting ready with the help of a stylist Dr. Kane had hired, choosing a midnight blue gown that made her feel like she was playing dress-up in someone else's life. When Dr. Kane appeared at her door in his perfectly fitted tuxedo, she barely recognized the cold, clinical man from his office. This version of Alexander Kane was charming and attentive, offering his arm as they walked into the ballroom and introducing her to colleagues and friends with what appeared to be genuine pride. He kept his hand on the small of her back as they moved through the crowd, leaned in to whisper explanations about various people they met, and smiled at her with such warmth that Maya almost forgot their relationship was purely contractual. The act was flawless and completely convincing. Dr. Kane spoke about their whirlwind romance with details that sounded so real Maya wondered if he had rehearsed them or if he was simply a gifted improviser. When people asked how they met, he told a story about encountering her at a coffee shop near the hospital, being struck by her kindness to an elderly customer, and knowing immediately that he had to ask her out. The way he looked at her while telling the story made Maya's heart skip in a way that was definitely not part of the contract. But the moment they returned to his car after the event, the warmth disappeared as quickly as if someone had flipped a switch. Dr. Kane was polite but distant during the drive home, asking if she had enjoyed the evening and whether she felt comfortable with the social expectations. When they arrived at the house, he wished her good night with the same professional courtesy he might have shown a colleague, leaving Maya standing in the foyer feeling strangely abandoned. This pattern repeated over the following weeks. In public, Dr. Kane was the perfect husband, attentive, affectionate, and convincingly in love. In private, he was courteous but remote, maintaining the careful distance he had established from the beginning. They shared exactly 3 meals together in those first 3 weeks, and the conversation during each was limited to logistics about upcoming events and questions about her comfort and needs. Maya began to understand that Dr. Kane's reputation for arrogance wasn't entirely accurate. He wasn't cruel or dismissive. He was simply detached in a way that suggested deep emotional walls rather than natural coldness. She noticed small things about him during their brief interactions, the way he always asked about her father's treatment progress, how he made sure she had everything she needed without being asked, and the occasional moments when his carefully controlled expression slipped and revealed something that looked like loneliness. The turning point came during their 4th week together, when Maya received a late-night call from the hospital about her father. There had been complications with his treatment, and while he was stable, the doctors wanted to adjust his medication and monitor him overnight. Maya was beside herself with worry, pacing her room and trying to decide whether she should go to the hospital or wait for morning. She was surprised when Dr. Kane appeared at her door, still dressed in scrubs from his own late surgery. Without being asked, he offered to drive her to the hospital and stay with her as long as she needed. During the drive, he explained the medical terminology the doctors had used over the phone, reassuring her that the complications were manageable and often part of the adjustment process with the experimental treatment. At the hospital, Dr. Kane spoke with her father's medical team and translated their explanations into language Maya could understand. He stayed beside her in the waiting room, bringing her coffee and quietly answering her anxious questions about her father's prognosis. When they finally allowed her to see her father, Dr. Kane waited in the hallway, respecting her privacy while remaining available if she needed him. It was 3 a.m. when they finally returned to the house, and Maya was emotionally exhausted. As they stood in the foyer saying goodnight, she impulsively thanked Dr. Kane for his kindness and support. For just a moment, his professional mask slipped completely, and she saw something raw and vulnerable in his expression before he quickly looked away and wished her goodnight. The shift in their relationship was subtle at first, like ice beginning to thaw around the edges. After the night at the hospital, Dr. Kane began joining Maya for breakfast when his schedule allowed, their conversations gradually expanding beyond logistics to include her father's progress, her thoughts about the social events they attended, and occasionally his own observations about the people they encountered together. Maya discovered that behind his controlled exterior, Alexander Kane was surprisingly perceptive about human nature. He could read the social dynamics of a room with the same precision he brought to surgery, understanding motivations and relationships that weren't immediately obvious. His dry sense of humor emerged during these breakfast conversations, particularly when describing the more ridiculous aspects of high society, social events they were required to attend. She also learned about his past, though he revealed information reluctantly and only in small pieces. His parents had died in a car accident when he was in medical school, leaving him with a substantial inheritance but no family connections. He had built his career and his fortune through relentless dedication to his work, but the social aspects of his position had always been challenging for him. Previous relationships had failed because women were interested in his money and status rather than who he actually was, leading him to conclude that emotional attachments were more trouble than they were worth. Maya began to understand that Dr. Kane's emotional distance wasn't arrogance but self-protection. He had learned to compartmentalize his feelings the same way he compartmentalized everything else in his life, creating neat, controlled categories that allowed him to function without vulnerability. Their arrangement appealed to him precisely because it was honest about being transactional, eliminating the possibility of disappointment or betrayal. But Maya's presence in his carefully ordered world was creating complications he hadn't anticipated. She wasn't impressed by his wealth or intimidated by his reputation. When he made cutting remarks about the people they met at social events, she gently challenged his assumptions, pointing out motivations and circumstances he might have missed. When he worked late and skipped meals, she made sure Maria left him dinner with notes that were friendly rather than worrying. Their public appearances became more natural, as Maya grew comfortable in her role. She no longer felt like she was acting when Dr. Kane introduced her to his colleagues, or when they danced together at charity galas. The chemistry between them, which had started as professional performance, was developing into something neither of them had expected. Maya found herself looking forward to their evenings out, not just because she was helping her father, but because she genuinely enjoyed Alexander's company when he allowed his guard to drop. The medical community began to notice the change in Dr. Kane as well. Colleagues commented that he seemed more relaxed, more approachable than he had been in years. His surgical staff noted that while he was still demanding and precise, he was less likely to snap at people during stressful procedures. The hospital board members who had pressured him to settle down were pleased with his new stability and the positive image his marriage projected. Maya's father continued to improve with his treatment, gaining strength and energy that allowed him to return to some of his normal activities. During her visits with him, he often asked about her employer, commenting that she seemed happier and more confident than she had been in months. Maya attributed the change to financial security and stable living conditions, but she was beginning to suspect there was more to it than that. The first real crack in Alexander's emotional walls appeared during a dinner party at their home. Maya had worked with Mrs. Henderson and Maria to plan an evening for several of Alexander's colleagues and their spouses, wanting to prove she could handle the social obligations of being his wife. The dinner was going perfectly until one of the guests, Dr. Patricia Williams, made a casual comment about Maya being lucky to have found such a successful husband. The comment was innocent enough, but it triggered something in Alexander that Maya had never seen before. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and she watched him struggle to maintain his composure as the conversation continued around them. Later, after their guests had left and they were cleaning up, Maya asked if she had done something wrong during the evening. Alexander's response surprised her with its intensity. He told her that she had been perfect, that the problem wasn't with her performance but with the whole situation. He hated that people assumed she was with him for his money, hated that their relationship was based on exactly the kind of transaction those people suspected, and hated that he had put her in a position where she had to pretend to care about him for financial reasons. The conversation that followed was the most honest they had ever had. Alexander admitted that the arrangement had become more complicated for him than he had expected, that Maya wasn't what he had thought she would be, and that he was struggling with feelings he hadn't anticipated. Maya found herself confessing that she had begun to care about him beyond their contractual obligations, that their relationship felt real to her even though she knew it was supposed to be purely business. They stood in his kitchen at midnight, surrounded by crystal glasses and fine china, acknowledging that their careful boundaries were dissolving. Alexander reached out to touch Maya's face, his hand gentle against her cheek, and for a moment she thought he might kiss her. Instead, he pulled back and said they needed to be careful not to complicate their arrangement with emotions that could hurt them both when it ended. But the acknowledgement that they had feelings for each other changed everything, even though they tried to pretend it hadn't. Their interactions became charged with an undercurrent of tension and awareness that made every accidental touch and shared glance feel significant. Maya found herself watching Alexander when he didn't know she was looking, studying the way he moved and the rare moments when his expression softened. Alexander began finding excuses to spend time with Maya that went beyond their contractual obligations. He invited her to join him for morning runs through the neighborhood, asked for her opinion on medical center business decisions, and started coming home earlier in the evenings to have dinner with her. When she mentioned missing her volunteer work at a local literacy center, he not only encouraged her to resume it, but offered to make a substantial donation to the organization. Their relationship was evolving into something neither of them had planned for, but both were too afraid to fully acknowledge what was happening. Maya worried that her feelings were just gratitude and proximity, that she was confusing emotional dependency with genuine affection. Alexander struggled with the knowledge that Maya was only with him because he was paying for her father's treatment, questioning whether anything between them could be real under those circumstances. The tension came to a head during a weekend trip to Alexander's lake house, ostensibly for a medical conference he was attending, but really because Maya had mentioned wanting to see the mountains. As they sat on the dock watching the sunset, sharing a bottle of wine and talking about everything except what was really happening between them, Maya realized she was falling in love with her husband, even though she wasn't supposed to be his wife in any way that mattered. The lake house weekend marked a turning point that neither Maya nor Alexander could ignore any longer. On their final evening there, they had walked along the shoreline after dinner, the conversation flowing as naturally as if they had known each other for years rather than months. When Alexander took her hand to help her over some rocks, he didn't let go afterward, and Maya didn't pull away. They stood at the water's edge, fingers intertwined, both knowing they were crossing a line they had carefully avoided. Back in the city, they continued to maintain the pretense that nothing had changed, but the shift was obvious to anyone who knew them. Well, Mrs. Henderson smiled knowingly when she noticed Alexander lingering over breakfast to talk with Maya. Maria began preparing romantic dinners without being asked, setting the table with candles and their finest china. Even James, the usually reserved gardener, commented that the house felt warmer and more alive than it had in years. Maya's father was now strong enough to return to light work, and his doctors were amazed by his response to the treatment. During one of Maya's visits, he asked directly about her relationship with her employer, saying he could hear something different in her voice when she talked about him. Maya found herself describing Alexander with an affection she couldn't hide, telling her father about his kindness, his dry humor, and the way he had supported her through her worried nights at the hospital. Alexander was dealing with his own internal struggle. His colleagues had noticed the change in him, commenting that he seemed more human, more approachable than he had been in years. Dr. Patricia Williams, who had known him since medical school, pulled him aside after a surgery and told him bluntly that whatever was happening in his personal life was good for him. She said she had never seen him look at anyone the way he looked at Maya, and it was about time he let someone past his defenses. The breaking point came during a hospital charity auction where Maya had volunteered to help with organization and registration. Alexander was scheduled to be the keynote speaker, but Maya was working behind the scenes and planned to slip out before his presentation. She was in the storage room organizing auction items when she overheard a conversation between two board members' wives that stopped her cold. They were discussing Alexander's marriage with the casual cruelty that some wealthy people reserve for gossip. One woman suggested that Maya was obviously a gold digger who had trapped Alexander with a sob story about her sick father. The other agreed, adding that she had heard rumors about Maya's background and financial situation, speculating about how much money Alexander was probably spending to maintain his new wife's lifestyle. Maya stood frozen among the auction items, hearing herself described as a manipulative opportunist who had seduced Alexander for his money. The worst part was that everything they said was technically true. She was with Alexander because he was paying for her father's treatment, and she had come from a completely different economic background. The fact that her feelings had become genuine didn't change the transactional nature of how their relationship had begun. When Alexander found her 20 minutes later, Maya was sitting on the floor of the storage room, surrounded by donated artwork and gift baskets, crying as quietly as she could manage. He immediately knelt beside her, his concern evident as he asked what had happened. When Maya repeated the conversation she had overheard, she watched Alexander's expression transform from worry to fury. Alexander helped Maya to her feet and, without saying another word, led her out of the storage room and directly to the podium where he was supposed to give his prepared speech about the hospital's mission and future plans. Instead, he took the microphone and began speaking about something entirely different. He talked about assumptions people make based on appearances and backgrounds. He spoke about the courage it takes to ask for help when someone you love is dying, and the strength required to sacrifice your own pride for another person's survival. He described meeting someone who challenged every preconception he had about relationships and showed him what it meant to put another person's needs before your. The room was completely silent as Alexander continued, his voice steady but filled with emotion Maya had never heard from him before. He said that he had learned more about genuine character and integrity from his wife than from anyone else in his life, and that anyone who questioned her motivations or her worth simply didn't understand what real love looked like. When he finished speaking, the applause was thunderous, but Maya barely heard it. She was staring at Alexander as he stepped down from the podium, his eyes finding hers immediately across the crowded room. The word love hung in the air between them, spoken publicly but meant privately, a declaration that changed everything they thought they understood about their arrangement. They left the auction early, driving home in a silence that was charged with unspoken questions and possibilities. In the foyer of their house, Alexander finally turned to face Maya, his usual composure completely gone. He told her that he hadn't planned to say what he had said, that the words had come out before he could stop them, but that he meant every single one. Maya stepped closer to him, close enough to see the vulnerability in his eyes that he usually worked so hard to hide. She told him that she had fallen in love with him somewhere between their first breakfast conversation and their walk by the lake, that she had been terrified to admit it because she thought he would see it as a complication to their business arrangement. When Alexander finally kissed her, it was with the intensity of months of suppressed emotion and careful distance finally being abandoned. They held each other in the grand foyer where Maya had first felt so out of place, both of them understanding that their relationship had become something entirely different from what they had originally agreed to. But even as they acknowledged their feelings for each other, the practical realities of their situation loomed large. Their contract still had more than a year remaining, and Maya couldn't escape the knowledge that everything she had, the house, the clothes, her father's medical care, depended on Alexander's continued financial support. The question that neither of them wanted to ask was whether their love could survive the transition from a business arrangement to a real marriage, or whether the foundation of their relationship would always be tainted by how it had begun. That night, as they lay together for the first time as a real couple rather than contracted partners, Maya wondered if love that grew from such artificial circumstances could ever truly be genuine, while Alexander wrestled with his fear that Maya might never be able to separate her feelings for him from her gratitude for what he had provided her family. The months following their emotional breakthrough were both the happiest and most complicated of Maya's life. Alexander had torn up their original contract, telling her that he wanted her to stay because she chose to, not because she was legally obligated to. But this gesture meant to free them both, created a new kind of uncertainty that neither had anticipated. Maya found herself questioning every emotion and decision, wondering if her love for Alexander was genuine, or if she had simply convinced herself she cared for him, because leaving would mean losing the security that had saved her father's life. Alexander struggled with similar doubts, afraid that Maya felt trapped by gratitude and financial dependence, unable to leave even if she wanted to because the consequences would be too devastating for her family. Their relationship settled into a new rhythm that was both more intimate and more fragile than before. Alexander continued paying for her father's ongoing treatment and had set up a trust fund to ensure his continued care, regardless of what happened between them. He insisted that Maya accept a substantial personal bank account so she would never feel financially trapped, but Maya worried that accepting his money made their relationship feel transactional again. The turning point came when Maya decided to return to nursing school, something she had put aside when her mother died and her father became ill. Alexander not only supported her decision, but helped her navigate the application process and arrange her schedule around her classes. Watching Maya pursue her own goals and rebuild her interrupted dreams gave him confidence that she was staying with him by choice rather than necessity. Maya's nursing program brought her into contact with other medical students and residents, including several who knew Alexander professionally. Through their eyes, she began to see a different picture of the man she had married. They described him as demanding but fair, brilliant in the operating room, and genuinely committed to his patients' welfare. She learned about the charitable work he did quietly, funding medical missions and providing free surgeries for children who couldn't afford them. One of her clinical rotations was in the cardiac surgery department where Alexander worked, and Maya got to observe him in his professional element for the first time. Watching him save lives with precision and skill that took her breath away, she understood that his reputation for arrogance was really just confidence born from expertise. She saw how his surgical team respected him, how patients trusted him, and how he carried the weight of responsibility for every life in his hands. Alexander, meanwhile, was learning to see Maya as she truly was, rather than through the lens of their unusual beginning. Her compassion with patients during her clinical rotations, her dedication to her studies despite the demands of their social obligations, and her continued devotion to her father showed him a strength and character that had nothing to do with their financial arrangement. The real test of their relationship came when Maya's father suffered a setback in his treatment, requiring additional procedures and extended hospitalization. Maya was exhausted from juggling her nursing classes, her worry about her father, and the social demands of being Alexander's wife. She broke down one evening, telling Alexander that she felt like she was failing at everything and wondering if she was strong enough to handle all the responsibilities in her life. Alexander's response showed Maya how much their relationship had evolved. Instead of trying to solve her problems or offering to reduce her obligations, he simply held her and listened. Then he quietly rearranged his own schedule to be more available during her father's crisis, helped her negotiate with her professors to manage her coursework, and took over some of their social commitments so she could focus on what mattered most. When her father recovered from the setback and was declared officially in remission, Maya realized that she had never once worried about the financial aspects of his care. Alexander had made sure that money was never a consideration in any medical decision, allowing her to focus entirely on her father's health and her own emotional needs. This freedom from financial stress had allowed their relationship to develop naturally, without the constant pressure of economic dependence. The conversation that finally resolved their remaining doubts happened on the second anniversary of the day they had met. Alexander took Maya back to the restaurant where they had their first dinner as a married couple, but this time, the nervous formality was replaced by easy intimacy. Over dessert, Maya told Alexander that she had initially agreed to marry him to save her father's life, but she was staying married to him because she couldn't imagine her life without him. Alexander responded by pulling out a small velvet box that contained not the elaborate diamond ring he had given her for their original arrangement, but a simple band that matched one he wore on his own finger. He told her that he wanted to marry her again, this time for all the right reasons with no contracts or conditions or time limits. He said he loved her not because she had agreed to be his wife, but because of who she was when she didn't think anyone was watching. Their second wedding was nothing like the elaborate ceremony that had formalized their business arrangement. This time they exchanged vows in the garden behind their house with only Mrs. Henderson, Maria, James, and Maya's father as witnesses. Maya wore a simple white dress she had chosen herself, and Alexander's voice broke slightly as he promised to love her not for 2 years or 5 years, but for the rest of his life. Maya's father, now healthy and strong enough to walk her down the aisle, gave a toast at their small reception that brought everyone to tears. He said he had watched his daughter sacrifice everything for his health, never expecting that her sacrifice would lead to finding the love of her life. He thanked Alexander not just for saving his life, but for seeing the extraordinary woman his daughter had always been. As they danced in their garden under stars that seemed brighter than usual, Maya thought about the desperate young woman who had walked into Mrs. Hartwell's townhouse 2 years earlier. That woman could never have imagined that agreeing to a loveless marriage would lead to finding a love deeper and more real than anything she had ever dreamed possible. Alexander, holding the woman who had transformed his carefully controlled world into something warm and unpredictable, and infinitely better, understood that sometimes the most unexpected paths lead to exactly where you're supposed to be. Their love story had begun with a contract and a desperate need, but it had become something that no amount of money could ever buy. A partnership built on genuine affection, mutual respect, and the choice to build a life together not because they had to, but because they couldn't imagine doing anything else.